I, 28, male, got engaged to my girlfriend of 3 years, 26, female, a few months back, and we were supposed to get married 2 days ago. My girlfriend was a normal and pretty laid back person before we got engaged, but as soon as she got the ring on her finger, she became this controlling and stubborn person who was unwilling to listen to anything I said. She was the one who planned the entire wedding and didn't take any of my opinions into consideration and did whatever she pleased. She invited whoever she wanted to, even my guests, including really old friends of mine who hadn't spoken to me in ages. I told her several times not to invite them since it'd just be awkward for everyone involved. But she was convinced that everyone who's ever known me needs to be invited, so eventually I just gave up trying and let her do whatever she wanted and just hoped that this new side of hers would go back into hiding once we got married. She'd always had control issues even before I met her. That's what my friend told me, who was the one who introduced me to her, but I hadn't imagined anything this bad. She needed to be the one running the show at all times, and everything she said had to happen or else she'd lose her mind over it. I dealt with it for the few weeks leading up to the wedding without a word, since I did love her, but then she did something absolutely unforgivable. While we were making a list of people to invite a few months ago, my fiancé had asked me about my sister. I was a little shocked because I told her very clearly a few months into our relationship that I'd gone no contact with my sister 10 years ago and hadn't heard from her since, which is the way I want it to be. She'd met my family 6 months into the relationship, and when she'd seen the multiple family photos on the walls, of course, she'd asked me who the identical girl standing beside me was in all my childhood photos, and I'd had to tell her about my estranged sister. My twin sister, 28, female, and I went no contact 10 years ago over an incident that changed my life for the worse. My sister and I weren't friends growing up. Although it'd be easy to be misled by the pictures since we looked like two happy kids, constantly hugging and smiling, but that was only for the sake of our parents. But behind the scenes, we'd constantly be at odds over every little thing. It wasn't even the cute little sibling rivalries that most people might be thinking about right now. We didn't love each other deep down. We straight up hated each other and tried our very best to one-up the other all the time. This didn't stop until we hit high school and I ended up scoring better than her on my SATs. She was furious about it and refused to even look at me for days after that, which was fine by me, and I felt like I'd beat her once and for all. Little did I know that the worst of it was yet to come. A few weeks later, it was time to see what colleges we'd been accepted into. Both my sister and I were straight A students, so we expected to be accepted into all the colleges that we applied to. My first choice was Yale, and hers was Princeton. I hadn't even considered applying to Princeton simply because I'd thought that if she'd been there, I would not want to end up at the same place. But my friends had convinced me to apply at the very last minute since I couldn't base decisions about my future on something as petty as whether my sister would be going to the same place. And it was about time that we let go of this silly rivalry. So I'd applied anyway. I'd made a huge deal of not applying to Princeton and had even rubbed it in her face at dinners. So when I changed my mind and did end up applying, I stayed quiet about it because it'd be pretty embarrassing to go back on my word after I'd been so dramatic about the whole thing. And to make matters worse, even my sister had said that she hadn't applied to Yale for similar reasons, probably to get back at me. But I don't suppose she'd gone back on her word. Anyway, eventually I ended up getting accepted into both, and while my sister did get accepted into Columbia, she didn't get accepted into Princeton. It was a huge blow for her since she'd talked about nothing apart from going to Princeton ever since senior year started. And I could tell that it was only going to get worse once she found out that I'd been accepted. And as it turned out, I was right. I planned on keeping my acceptance to Princeton a secret because it wasn't like I was going to go and my sister didn't need to know. I wasn't scared of offending her, but I just didn't want any extra drama before I left for college. But I guess my parents had found out about it somehow. They'd probably gone through our mail. Anyway, my mom decided to throw us both a surprise party that very afternoon with the names of all the colleges written in frosting on our cakes. I didn't know anything about it. If I had, maybe I would have done something to prevent it. As soon as my sister saw Princeton on my cake, she scoffed and said that I hadn't even applied, but I think she must have guessed from my face what the truth was. She began screaming in my face about how I'd ruined her life and stolen her future from her, while I tried to explain that I had no idea that she wouldn't get accepted and didn't mean to do this to her. But of course, given our history of competition and rivalry, that was sort of hard to believe, even though I truly did feel bad about what had happened. After a while, she finally seemed to run out of steam and stormed out of the house in tears. I sat in the living room while my parents told me how sick they were of our constant fighting and that both of us had some serious growing up to do. I couldn't blame them either because they tried their very best to mend things between us, but we just seemed to have come out of the womb hating each other, so they'd given up and had just let us do our thing once we were in high school. I decided to take my parents' advice so that my sister and I could at least be civil to each other. So 15 minutes after she left, I went out to talk to her. Most of our guests had left after my sister's outburst, and it was pretty dark as well outside. I couldn't see my sister out there and tried to call out her name, but before I knew what was happening, I felt something really hard hit the back of my head, and I collapsed to the ground. After that, I only remember being in excruciating pain and screaming out for help before I passed out. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital room with my wrist in a bandage. Once I'd woken up, my parents informed me that my psycho sister had been waiting outside for me to come out, and when I called out her name, she hit me in the head with a freaking shovel. And then, for good measure, she'd stepped on my left wrist as hard as she could, which is why it was dislocated. I could hardly even believe what they were saying, because while I'd had my fair share of differences with my sister, I couldn't even imagine doing something so psychotic and depraved to her. Not just to her, for that matter, but anyone at all. My parents had begged me not to press charges against my own sister, which is why I'd let that go. But after that, I never met my sister again or even asked my parents about her. I don't know what college she went to or where she went after that incident. My parents had sent her away, and I never asked where. I knew that they still kept in touch with her since they'd go away on the weekends. They wouldn't mention who they were going to visit, but I wasn't a fool. I knew they were going to see my sister. I never held it against them since this was their best bet, keeping us apart from one another since we clearly brought out the worst in each other. After I had recovered and been deemed fit by the doctors, I started college, but since I'd missed a few weeks already, I was way behind and my grades that semester weren't satisfactory to me. On top of that, I used to get frequent migraines because of the head injuries, and the lump at the back of my head was a constant reminder of what my own sister had done to me in a fit of rage. Needless to say, I was pretty emotionally disturbed that year and had to get therapy to feel like myself again. It's been 10 years since, and I've moved on with my life now. My parents and I never talk about my sister, and neither does anyone else from my family. I'm sure they've all still kept in touch with her, but have the good sense to never bring her up when they're around. So when my fiancé asked about her, I told her that we weren't inviting her and assumed that that would be the end of the discussion. I'd never told her exactly what had happened, but I don't think I should have to be very honest. Just the fact that we haven't spoken in over 10 years should be reason enough for her to understand that I absolutely don't want my sister around. Not now and not ever again. She should have respected that. But she started hounding me and didn't stop for days until I snapped at her and told her that if she brought my sister up again, then I'd call off the whole wedding. That seemed to shut her up for a while. But then, 2 days back on the day of our wedding, I realized what she'd done behind my back. On the day of our wedding, I was standing up in front of the minister waiting for my fiancé to walk down the aisle. The music started and the bridesmaids started walking, and that's when I noticed my sister among them, walking arm in arm with one of my friends who looked as confused as I felt. Even my sister looked really lost. I was speechless for a few seconds and had absolutely no idea what was happening. My fiancé finally walked down the aisle, looking really happy and smiling widely, but I didn't feel anything apart from anger and betrayal. I knew this was her doing and couldn't believe she'd even pulled something like this. And on our wedding day, no less. I felt completely blindsided, so of course I didn't feel particularly emotional, and most of my guests could understand why I had an awful look on my face while my bride was walking down the aisle towards me. When she was finally standing across from me, still sporting that smile, I didn't waste a second and asked her why my sister was there when I'd categorically told her not to invite her under any circumstances. She told me that she didn't want to have that discussion and wanted to get married first, but obviously that was not going to happen, not anymore. So I told her that we needed to talk about this right now, and she admitted that she told my parents that I'd been talking about wanting to reconcile with my sister before getting married, which is how she'd managed to persuade them to get her my sister's address and contact info. She told me that she'd worked really hard to convince them just so she could surprise me, and even had the audacity to say that she thought that it was about time that we made peace with our past, even though she had no idea what had actually happened 10 years ago. We were up there arguing back and forth for like 5 minutes while our guests waited, and finally I realized that there was just no point in fighting for our relationship anymore. I was done and didn't want anything to do with this woman, so I just walked out of the wedding. I could hear her calling for me to come back, but I didn't pay any heed to it and continued walking until I reached my car. Then I started driving and kept driving until sunset. I couldn't find any decent hotels around, so I decided to sleep in my car itself. I canceled everything on the phone in the evening and ignored all the calls and messages from my fiancé and family on purpose. Thankfully, I had enough gas to go back home the next day, but as soon as I saw my fiancé's car in the driveway, I decided to live at a hotel instead. It's been 2 days and I haven't responded to any of my fiancé's calls or texts. My parents have also been trying to get through to me, but I can't bother with them right now, honestly. I can't even believe they were stupid enough to think that I'd suggest reconciling with my sister ever, and fell for my fiancé's lies. The least they could have done was call me up to confirm if this is what I wanted, but they chose to believe that this is the kind of surprise I would have wanted at my wedding. Most of all, I'm beyond pissed off at my fiancé because of what she did. She had absolutely no right to go behind my back, manipulate my parents, and then bring my sister, whom I'd been no contact with for 10 years, to our wedding. She'd created a royal mess of things, none of which would have happened if she just respected what I'd said. A few hours ago, she sent me a really long text about how she'd only found out what had really happened all those years ago from my parents yesterday after I walked out of the wedding. She apologized for blindsiding me and agreed that she should have listened to me when I said I didn't want my sister at our wedding. She also mentioned that my parents and friends were livid that she'd done something of this sort, and she'd received an earful from all of them. But she also added that she thought that I should have mentioned the specifics of my great fallout with my sister, and should have mentioned the exact reason why I didn't speak to her anymore, so that she wouldn't have invited her. I don't agree with that in the least. Yeah, maybe that would have helped, but I shouldn't have to spell out everything for her. It was a painful memory for me, and I don't like talking about it. Besides, she should have just believed me when I told her that I didn't want my sister anywhere near me. Nobody just cuts off their sister for 10 years without a valid reason, and she should have known that. It was a horrible time for me, and maybe sometime in the future I would have told her, but until then, she could have just taken my word for it. I'm not getting married to her anymore, that's for sure, but I don't know if I owe her an apology either. I don't feel particularly sorry about it, and if anything, she should be the one apologizing without blaming me. So, what do you guys think? AITA for not telling my fiance exactly why I'd cut my sister off all those years ago? Update 1. I've been living in the hotel for 3 days now. I posted my question yesterday and I guess I was right not to apologize, so I'm back to ignoring her. I did speak to my mom this morning though. It was weird and strained, but she told me that she was terribly sorry for what had happened and that she should have known that I'd never want my sister around. She explained to me that my fiancé had gotten in touch with them a few weeks ago and had pretty much been trying to convince them for weeks before they agreed to give out my sister's information. My fiancé had also forced them into promising her that they wouldn't speak to me about it since she wanted it to be a surprise, and in hindsight, they do think that it was a stupid decision on their part. I'm glad that they realized that and apologized for it too. I'm not sure if I feel like forgiving them just yet, since I'm pretty torn up about my feelings right now, but eventually I guess I will forgive them, just not now. I'm planning on going back home in a few days, but I have to make sure that my fiancé isn't there when I get back. Obviously, she'll be the one moving out since the house is actually mine. I'll give her enough time to pack up and move out, which is more than what she deserves. Anyway, this relationship is definitely over now, and I'm honestly just relieved. Update 2. I told my fiancée a few days back that she needed to vacate the house as soon as possible and gave her 5 days to do it. Today is the 6th day, and I went back to my house believing that she'd be gone by now since she texted me back saying that she'd move out by today. So I went back home, and to my surprise, I found her waiting for me in the living room. Very cleverly, she'd probably managed to park her car somewhere else so that I'd think she wasn't there anymore, and I fell for it. I was really annoyed to see her there and told her that I really wasn't in the mood to discuss anything with her right now. True to character, my fiancé didn't pay any attention to what I was saying and started rambling about how she'd been worried sick for these past few days and that I should have at least told her where I was. I don't know why, but for some reason my fiancé had just assumed that in spite of everything that had happened, we could just resume our relationship and continue from where we'd left off, as if she'd paused a game or something. When I didn't respond, she continued to speak and told me that it was really messed up on my part that I didn't let her in on the whole situation with my sister, and even accused me of withholding information from her that could have put her in harm's way since she'd gone to visit my sister. That's when I lost it. I couldn't believe she had the audacity to even pretend that this was my fault, so I told her really bluntly to get the hell out of my house right that minute, and that we were over. She seemed a little taken aback. I guess she'd been taking everything I said really lightly, so she didn't see this coming. She tried to argue with me and looked ready to cry, but tears weren't going to affect me anymore. I told her that she needed to leave right that second because I just couldn't stand the sight of her, and the sound of her voice was driving me nuts. I just couldn't take her crap anymore. I wanted her to leave for good. I think I must have struck a nerve there because she burst into tears then and there, but I was so emotionally exhausted that I didn't even bother consoling her and just left her crying there, while I went into my bedroom and locked myself in there to take a nap. I must have been asleep for a while because when I woke up, it was dark outside and my fiancé was gone. I know that she'd come back later to take her things with her, but for now, I'm finally on my own and have some space to think and process everything that's happened to me this week. Update 3. It's been 3 days since my fiance left, but she hasn't been able to accept the fact that we're over yet and has been calling me every single day. I'm not answering any of them, but I do feel a little sorry for her. As for my parents, they dropped by yesterday and apologized profusely for whatever happened and took all the blame upon themselves. I also finally asked them what my sister had been up to all these years, and they told me that after that incident, they sent her away to an anger issues rehabilitation center where she spent several months undergoing treatment and intensive therapy since her mental issues were clearly a lot more severe than mine. Once she was cleared, she finally started college but had to rent an apartment where she lived by herself, and my parents would visit her on the weekends. She seemed a lot more normal and stable after that and even started working at around the same time as me. For the past 7 years, she'd been living a little out of town and ran her own business, which was nice, I guess. They also told me that after I walked out of the wedding, my sister seemed to sense that she'd caused this and left immediately after apologizing to our parents for showing up. Apparently, she'd been told by my fiance that this was just a rehearsal and not the actual wedding, but it all seemed pretty real to her, which is why she looked so confused. My parents also handed me a letter that my sister had written to me, and after they left, I finally opened it up and read it. It's been an hour since then, and I'm still shattered by it. She'd apologized for every single thing that she'd put me through while we were kids and then as teens, and promised me that she'd changed now. Her words seemed full of regret about how we could have been the best of friends but are just bitter strangers now, and said that while she didn't hold any hope to reconcile any time soon because of her violent streak, she did wish that I'd forgive her someday and that we'd have a real, genuine shot at being the kind of siblings that people would want us to be. I teared up reading that, and I guess I do want the same thing. I'll give myself some time to think about it, and maybe if I feel ready for it, I'll forgive her someday since I've been pretty cruel to her as a child, too. For now, I just want to rebuild my life and focus on improving my mental state since the past few months have really taken a toll on me. Honestly, I'm just waiting for my fiancé to come and take back her stuff so that I can block her and move on with my life once and for all. I think I've had enough drama for a lifetime, and I'm just done. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.